Hey, today on Pass the Baton, just wanted to talk about a thought that I've heard so many people bring up, and you could really study this, each one. You could do this for weeks if you really wanted to, but that is the one another's in the Bible. And honestly, it depends a little bit about the wording and which translation you use about how many that you find as far as one another's. I've heard people say 55. A lot of sources will say 59. So about 60, 55 or 60 one another's, and I'm in no way going to go over every one of those today, but just wanted to kind of talk about them just a little bit in this video. And a lot of the reason why you bring it up is you cannot, and I honestly heard Andy Stanley is who I heard say this a long time ago, but he said you cannot do one another's sitting in a row. So if you're in church, you're just at church, you just go just to listen. You just go to be there. Just go because it's part of what you think you're supposed to do. You're not going to be doing one another's. You do one anothering when you're out and not in the church. It's part of your life to do one another's. And really, I saw this book. I didn't actually read the book. I thought about ordering it soon, but there's a book out called 58 to 0. And of course, their 58 was the one another's. And I don't know why they get 58 and some sources get 59, but basically, what they were trying to say in the 58 to 0 is that one another's 58, the pastor to the people 0. Now, it may not be quite to that extent, but the point is, your gift, everyone has a gift in the church, and we're to do that to one another. It all has to do with other people. It has to do with fellowship. From the very beginning in the Bible, you see that God created Adam, and he said it is not good that man should be alone. So he created woman. In the image of God, they were both created, man and woman. But he said he did this because it was not good that man should be alone. And you see this theme several times throughout the scripture. Point being, whether it's actually at the church or in your life. Now, I think the local church is extremely important, and a lot of that is so that you can know some people that you can do one anothering with. But you also have to take this outside of that building. You have to take it outside of just those people even. Now, Paul, when he talks about what you should do this first to the household of faith, and then, so it's important, those people that believe, first off, that you would do one another's with them, but also to the whole world, which is what Jesus would do. Now, these one another's, if you just look them up, and I kind of have it on my screen down here, so you might see me a lot looking back and forth and maybe looking up a few verses, but Jesus does not use the phrase. He's not saying to do one another very often. And really, of the 59 one another's that's in this list that I'm looking at, they don't really start. There's only one in the book of Mark, and then there's several in John. And then from there, it just goes mostly in Paul's writing. So Jesus really doesn't use very many. Now, I'm going to show you just a couple that Jesus uses with pretty much the same theme except for this one in the book of Mark. In Mark chapter 9, when Jesus is talking, and he's talking about this, if the salt have lost its savor, wherewith shall it be good for? And he says, have salt in yourselves and have peace one with another. Now, this is Jesus, and really he's given kind of a lesson here, but just consider the importance of that, to have peace one with another, and consider the warfare we have within our communities, even Christians, and really, just because someone says they're a Christian, obviously it doesn't mean that they are, but we have different factions. You might call them, whether it's Presbyterian, Baptist, Pentecostal, you have that, and then you also have so many other things where, Seventh-day Adventist and Mormonisms, which, I personally do not consider Mormons Christian, and I could give you my reasoning for that, and their belief in Jesus Christ and where he comes from. I mean, that he literally comes from God and Mary in a union there, and so he was a physical child of that and not of Joseph and Mary. Now, that's some of what I've heard from Mormonism, what they believe. It's kind of hard to get into that and think that is really Christian, to believe that Jesus is God. They kind of have a different view of that completely. So I can't say that Mormons are Christians. Now, Seventh-day Adventists, obviously, they believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. we differ greatly on the fact of works versus grace personally, and even the whole seventh day. I don't care when you go to church, I don't care any of that. And Paul, that's what he says. Don't put one day above another. But Seventh-day Adventists believe you have to go on Saturday, which is the Sabbath. So not getting into any of that, whether someone's Christian or not, but we have all these differences and arguing, really, that goes on. And Jesus said, of all to one another's he could say, he said, have peace one with another. Now, sometimes it just has to be where you understand you're not going to agree with this person. Now, I'm talking about within Christianity. I'm talking about within the church. There may be certain things that you cannot agree with. But if someone believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he died for your sins, they believe that main gospel, that he rose again the third day, then we have to have some sort of an agreement of peace there with those people. You may disagree with things, whatever it is, the sign gifts or on, whatever that may be that you differ on, but have peace one with another. I mean, this is only two things really that Jesus talks about to do with one another, and this is one of them, to have peace one with another. So how important is that? And consider this, it's something, all of these is something that has to be done with another person, with fellowship, the importance of having other people in your life. There's times when it's not possible to have but so many people in your life, but the point is, those people you have, you're doing ministry. It's one with another. Now, Mark was pretty much one, and you might, like I said, if you just look up in your Strong's Concordance, you may find a little differently than what we're talking about here today. But once you get to the book of John, Jesus talks about to wash one another's feet in chapter 13. So that's something that really, I mean, consider that too. There are churches, old order religions for the most part, like maybe the Brethren Church and the Hutterites, the Amish, those people, they practice some of these things. And Jesus, he washed the feet, and it's, we definitely should consider the symbolism in this, but he says to do this, and so there are people that take this literally, they wash one another's feet. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. But Jesus says that. So when I said a couple things, this is not the main one that I want to talk about that Jesus literally talks about. But he says to have peace with one another. He says to wash, one another's feet there in chapter 13. And then as you get through chapter 13, and this is where Jesus really brings out what he talks about with one another. And everybody that's listening to this video, I'm sure have heard this, but he says, in verse 34, chapter 13 of John, he says, a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another. Now, this is what Jesus sticks with this. He says it like 3 or 4 times. As I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another. Now, that's the main thing that Jesus talks about. This is the new commandment that he talks about, to love your neighbor as yourself, to love one another. So the main one another that we see in Scripture is this, to love one another. When you get all the way toward the end of the New Testament, you get into 1 John, you see to love one another several times, 5, 6, 7 times. So like almost 1/3 of the one another's in Scripture is to love one another. It's hard to understand how people can see other humans and not at least have that love for one another. In other words, how can we look at someone and see that they're going through horrible times and not feel some sort of something for them? I was just talking to my daughter just a few minutes ago before I walked down the steps to do this video, and we were just talking about that and how you have to, once you become friends with somebody, once you're literally talking to them, it makes it different when they have these differences. When they, completely believe differently than Christians do. When they think there's just some alternate life and they're just going to die and just go somewhere else. It's one thing to understand that people believe that, but when it's your friends, when it's someone that you talk to, every single day, surely we could have some sort of thought process toward how can we talk to them. I mean, do we not care? Do we just want to hang around with the people that we go to church with? No, we should love one another. It goes outside of just your church and your congregation. It goes outside so much further out, that we are to love one another. And if we do that, really all the other one another's kind of comes into this. If you're loving one another, you're going to do a lot of these one another's. Now, this is just a basic video on the one another's. A few of the one another's goes along with what we just said about washing one another's feet, and that is to greet one another with a holy kiss. I think that's mentioned like 4 times. So that's literally, it's such an odd thing that that's mentioned more than some things that we really push in our churches. Or at least, the churches that I'm familiar with, that I've grown up in, there's certain things that we just really want to hound on or just continue talking about. But Paul, in his writings, especially Paul, he says to greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, I'm like Mike Pearl. Michael Pearl was an extremely avid Bible teacher. He does verse by verse. As far as I know, he's still doing it. I have not listened to him other than just small clips in years. But one of the things I heard Mike Pearl talk about in one of the books he's teaching from, and he was a really strong King James only advocate, and he said, I believe every word is inspired, he says, but I just can't hardly believe that. And of course, he says that joking, and of course, he's not going out in his congregation and greeting one another with a holy kiss, nor do I plan on it. But we can extend that in another way. In our culture, it would be shaking a hand, which now is almost impossible to do because of COVID. So we don't have any kind of contacts. The social aspect is just so grim right now, and hopefully that is getting better. But if not, we still have to do these things. We do them the best we can with the people that's in front of us, with our neighbors, physical neighbors. We should be doing this. I'm not doing nearly as good a job as I know that I should. But one another's is something that we all can be doing and should be doing. And Jesus, he says to love one another. Now, I'm just going to go through a few of these as I kind of come up on some of the ones that I wanted to talk about. But even in Romans, you see kind of the same thought process that's going on in Romans. And what I mean by thought process is, I'll give you an example. Like in chapter 12, it said, "Be kindly affectioned one to another." Now, I'm reading from the King James now. I'm familiar with it, and it's easy for me to put it up here. But it says, "Be kindly affectioned one to another." And this basically just means that fondness. It says especially of one's kindreds when you look at up in the Strongs, but to one another with brotherly love and honor, preferring one another. And you see Paul kind of goes on into this in chapter 12, to love one another, to prefer one another. Verse 16, same chapter, he says, "Be of the same mind one toward another, mind not high things, not condescend to men of low estate, be not wise in your own conceit." So, he's just basically saying that we shouldn't be, arrogant or put ourselves above other people, to one another, as he says when he's talking about this. Paul, even in 1 Corinthians, even says when you come together to eat, he said, wait for one another. And it gets to the end of the chapter, he says, greet one another with a holy kiss, where we talked about. And in the book of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, he ends it the same exact way. In Galatians, I'm going to just go to Galatians here. This may be a shorter video. Some of you are probably excited about that if you're listening. Some may not be. In Galatians chapter 5, it says, "For brethren, ye have been called into liberty, only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another." It's one thing that can truly, truly help. If you're down in the dumps, if you're depressed, and I know that there's some chemical things that go along with depression, you'll never convince me that there's not. I understand that. If you have a broken bone, you're going to go to the doctor. You're going to get it fixed. If you're having mental problems, it's okay to go to the doctor with that as well. But there's also a spiritual oppression. I think sometimes it can just really come upon people, and even Christians. Sometimes it just really bothers you. I think physically, when we see the physical part of this, and like I said, it's okay to go to a doctor for that as well. But I think personally, the best thing you can do for that, honestly, is just physical activity. It gets the natural things going, and sometimes maybe you cannot do the physical activity. You can't actually do these things, but it's one of the better things that you can do. But also, what I'm trying to get out, one of the best things you can do is serve somebody else, serve one another. I've heard people say this: if you really want to feel good about the health that you have, just go to a nursing home or something and just walk around and talk to some people. It's not an easy ministry, but there are certain things about that. And like as with COVID, as we've said already before, you can't really even do this right now. But just there are so many places. I know every community that's of any size probably has some sort of a place that you can volunteer. I know here in Mount Airy we have Yoke Fellow, we have the Surrey Medical Ministries. There's certain things around here personally that I know you can volunteer at. I know there's also things in other places. But when you can see other people's needs sometime and literally give into that, and it's what a lot of times in church we forget the people that we're actually with every week, that they have needs as well, and we want to feel it's almost like we miss the forest for the trees. We want to do all these big things outside, but sometimes serving the people right there is extremely important. That may be something as simple as cutting a load of firewood for them. It may be taking them a meal, whatever that is. But by love, he says in this passage, serve one another. The importance of that, and the importance of just one another's, and that's something that we can all do, and we can't do it while we're just sitting in the church. Just in the church, if you're sitting listening, you're not doing one another's. That's not to say we shouldn't sit in the church, because it's a big part of how we learn. It's how we get to know each other and those sort of things. But the point I'm trying to make is the one anothering that we do takes place outside of that capacity. Just we'll go through a couple other ones here in Galatians again, chapter 5, verse 26 says, "Let us not be desirous of vainglory, provoking one another, envying one another." It says, don't provoke one another. Don't envy. Don't even envy one another. It's so important that we just consider, instead of looking at what everybody else has or trying to, bring anger out on someone else, let's just live our own lives. I have a hard time doing this sometimes myself. But don't provoke one another. Don't be envying, or in other words, don't be jealous of other people. It goes all the way back even to the Ten Commandments when it says, don't what your neighbor has. Don't want that. He says, don't be jealous of one another. So there's some one another's here that he's saying not to do, and some that you should do. But it all goes back to the fact that we can do these ourselves. Then you get into chapter 6 of Galatians, and here's a big one. And consider that this is in the church, as most of these really are within the church. But he says, or in other words, within saved people, your family, our family as Christians. It says, "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens." This click on this. This is another reason why I kind of like when I'm studying to use the KJV, because I can just click on the Strongs here and see exactly what this means, which I've looked at it before. But here it basically just means a weight. It's a load. So whatever the load is that you're under, the weight that you're under, it says, bear ye one another's weights. Those things that are bothering the others around you, can you help them with that? Is there a way that we can? Sometimes you just can't. Sometimes that person may not want you to do that. but the one another's that we can do, that we should do. This is so important. It's a part of being a Christian. It's a part, honestly, that I think sometimes the church just fails to even talk about. To actually do real ministry for one another and not just looking at it as a box to check off. So, and the remainder of the verse, bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Christ's law that we started out in John chapter 13, to love your neighbor as yourself, this new commandment I give you. That is the law of Christ. When you bear one another's burdens, you are fulfilling the law of Christ. You're loving your neighbor. On and on and on we can go. If you lie to your neighbor, obviously you don't love them. So you can see how those commandments, even the 10 commandments, do get into to love your neighbor as yourself. Because you're not going to murder your neighbor if you love them. And of course, Jesus, when he talks in Matthew chapter 5, he says, if you hate your brother without a cause, then you've the same as murdered him. So that is where loving your neighbor as yourself. It's how Jesus kind of put all that together. So bear one another's burdens. In the book of Ephesians, look up a couple in the book of Ephesians. Forbearing one another in love. Said with long suffering, forbearing one another in love. Have patience with each other. It would be good, honestly, for married couples just to get together every now and then and just look up some of the one another's and try to do to one another's, to forbear one another. It says, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Ephesians in verse 25. Put away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor. We are members one of another. Be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. And then it gets to verse 32. Says, be kind one to another. It's civility. It's just doing what we know is the right thing to do. Be kind one to another. And then he says, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. These are the things we can do for one another. The whole point is that we should be in community. And that's the importance of the church. And Paul gives several others, one another's, and I said I was going to be short, and I look up at my time and see that I've been 20-something minutes already, but I'm just going to go to Hebrews, and this is a verse that I've actually did a whole video on, pretty much in Hebrews chapter 10 before. And it's basically about gathering together. And I just want you to see the importance of what it is saying and the community and the one anothering. It says, let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works. So consider one another, the ones that's around you, to provoke them, to encourage them to do what you can with them, to love and to good works. To do good works for those that are around you. Consider that. And he says, not forsaking the assembling. And this is the verse you hear so many times. I've done a whole video on this. He said, don't forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another. So much of Paul's writings, talking about the church, the people that you're around, those that you're worshiping with, it's to encourage one another, to exhort one another, to edify one another. He literally says that he that prophesieth, when he's in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, said, he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification and exhortation and comfort. Now, when you continue studying that through there, and he says it's better that you he said, I would love that everybody would do this, that they would prophesy. And he says, literally says, if someone comes into your congregation, this is in 1 Corinthians 14, he says, and they see you doing this. Now, he uses the word, if they see you prophesying. But when you see earlier, he had just said, edify, exhort, and comfort. So, in other words, if someone walks in, they see you edifying, exhorting, and comforting one another, they would just fall on their face and worship God and say that God is in you. So that is the importance of the one anothering. It's not even the fact that we could just one another and help someone around you, but if other people see us as Christians doing these things to one another, if we one another someone else this morning, and it's not to pat myself on the back because I don't do this often, but one of the guys I work with, he just happened to be behind me in line at breakfast, and I said, put his on mine. And so he said, don't do that. And he said, why are you doing that? And I said, because I want to. He seemed taken back by it, as if he was really shocked that I would pay for his breakfast. But that's just such a small thing. And just consider that when we are doing for one another's, that is what's going to make someone want to be a Christian. In other words, they're going to see, okay, maybe there's something to this. Instead of just seeing a bunch of people arguing or a bunch of people that just, I don't know, stuffy old religion, as we want to say so often. The one another's is so extremely important. Now, if you've hung with me this long, that's the main point I want to bring out in this, is that we should exhort, we should encourage, we should edify, we should love one another. Because it's not for us, it's not even for that necessarily for that person you're doing it for, but it's for so many around it seeing you do these one another's, to understand that maybe there is something different about Christianity. Because just like so many other religions, we have a lot of baggage. We just do. Christianity's had some bad history. And we could say, well, they weren't really Christians, they weren't doing the right thing. Well, I agree, but when you look at the Crusades, you look at all these things, it was done in the name of Christianity. And there's just a blot on so many things. You could look at slavery. You could look at on at things that people who called themselves Christians have done. And listen, we've all made mistakes. But the point is that we minister to the ones that's in front of us, that we love those that are around us, and we do to one another's. And the only way we can do it is by just doing it. Just go out into your community, go out to the ones you work with, go out to the ones even at your church, and just do something extra for them. If you know someone in your congregation maybe needs a little extra money for something they're going through right now, don't wait for the church to do it. Just do it. Just one another with them. If they have a need and you know it, help them out. Whether that's physical or economical, just do it. Just be an example of one anothering. And let's not only make the world a better place, but let's do what Jesus told us to do. Let's do the work that Jesus would have us do, and that is to fulfill the law of Christ, to love your neighbor as yourself. And if you love Christ and what he did for you, wouldn't we want to do the things that he told us to? So hopefully this one another's just maybe just at least perked your interest to study it a little bit. I know this is kind of a little bit of a different video than what I've been doing, but hope this helps. And until next time.